Well, what I wanted to do is just cover some of the work that I've been doing in BC, looking at different ethnic variants in pediatric inflammatory bowel disease and some of the outcomes that we'd noticed from that. First and foremost though, happy Valentine's Day, very important day, it's very notable, and I think it's a great honour to see, particularly knowing Dr. Garashenka's association with the kidney, that the GI service has been asked to present on a day that is obviously traditionally a very cardiac oriented day. And from my point of view, that's long overdue. I think that there may be some issues we run into, and Hallmark may have problems with it. But if you think about it, if you really just put it honestly, I'm sure cardiac could work out something. So we're going to start off though with a little quiz. So if you've got your eye clickers there, on the bottom button is your on-off button. So first you need to turn it on. And we're going to have a little bit of interactive time, make sure everyone's awake. So the quick question, obviously we're talking about inflammatory bowel disease. So a very easy one to start off with. The incidence of inflammatory bowel disease is A, decreasing, B, increasing, C, much the same as it's always been, or D, which incident are we referring to? I'll give you a few seconds to log your answers. Apologies to the remote site. You'll have to just do a poll within your room. Be honest. So, there we go. Consensus almost on it's increasing. Unfortunately, everyone knows what incidence is, so we didn't have any... I know one person. So yes, it is increasing, which is an interesting phenomenon in its own right, and we're going to cover a little bit about that today. One of the... there we go. The second question we've got is the cause of inflammatory bowel disease. We have a few options: genetic, infectious, dietary, bad luck, or all of the above. I get a little display here how quickly people are doing it. It's like the race of the minds. All right, let's see the results. All of the above, genetic, mostly. So again, we'll cover this. Bad luck is probably for any disease that's diagnosed, to be honest, let's be. But in fact, we are seeing that there is a very combined effect of this. And again, we'll cover some of the nuances of this and just what role in genetic and other factors play. And this is for my personal benefit, being my first winter here. So I'm just trying to gauge the environment. This winter has been surprisingly mild, fairly standard for Edmonton, cold even for Edmonton. Some people seem to be very cold. And as you get a few people from up north further, the Yukon and the like, winter, what winter? Nothing under -40 is winter around here. Let's be serious. If you can't plug your car in, fairly standard. Okay. One person thought it was... I don't know, we didn't have an E option. That's it. 4% of the room, we didn't even have an option for that. So that was summer. It's the wrong season. It's me. Okay. So moving on. So pediatric IBD. The descriptive epidemiological studies that we have on looking at pediatric IBD as well as adult IBD certainly report that there is an increase in the incidence. Now, a lot of these reports do reflect single centre studies, and so we have to be a little bit cautious from a methodological and epidemiological point of view when we look at these studies, in the sense that is it the referral patterns, is it our diagnostic skill, is it the way that specialised centres are being set up, that they're reporting an increased incidence, i.e. they're diagnosing more within their specialist centre, but perhaps the incidence isn't truly increasing. We've now had several fairly good population-based studies, both from Canada, from Europe, and from the States, that have supported an overall increase in the incidence, both within adult populations and within pediatric populations. Some other changes that we've seen in Western countries certainly is that Crohn's disease seems to be certainly the one increasing, whereas ulcerative colitis in most studies now has somewhat plateaued. The prevalence is staying much the same, but we're not seeing an increasing in the incidence naturally. Other interesting epidemiological observations that have been made is that there tends to be differences internationally. So we have this west versus east, so that in Western developed countries, North America, Canada, Australia, whether you consider that west or down under or whatever, these rates seem to be higher than traditionally what's been considered eastern countries, so primarily Asia, Asia Pacific. But we've also seen a north-south gradient, so that northern hemisphere rates have been much higher than southern hemisphere rates. And even within continents, the northern aspects of continents have been found to be higher than southern aspects of continents, and we've seen that within North America. So these are some interesting things that raise the question of what impact does the environment, what impact does maybe ethnic tendencies for those regions to have on the incidence of IBD, and given an increasingly global population and mobile international population, is this changing? If we look briefly at some of the studies that have been done over the years, you can see that this temporal increase in incidence at least has been quite noted. So most studies over the years, even going back as far as 1970, in retrospective studies, have shown fairly significant increases. In some countries, like in Stockholm and in the Czech Republic, we've seen really very significant increases in incidence reported. Now these are all adult studies. In Scotland's had a number of very good population-based studies where they have regions of hospitals that contribute to certain diagnostic groups. So again, these are not so much single centre as much as multi-centre or some population studies. So across the board, we are seeing this consistent trend towards an increase in incidence over time. Specifically, when we look at paediatrics and Canadian paediatrics at that, because you asked the question, why would you leave Australia to come to Canada? Foolishly, for whatever reason, it has the highest rate of IBD. So if you're interested in IBD, you go where the gold is, I suppose. And it seemed a good thing to do at the time. Why Edmonton? Well, we can discuss that at another time. But the incidence, certainly in an excellent study that was done in Toronto, or in Ontario, by Eric Benchimol and his group through out of the Sick Children's, has shown using an administrative database study where they actually looked at the coding and the billing through the hospital, through the provincial administration data, rather than just as a single centre. And they identified algorithms that allowed cases that had been diagnosed or had been followed with a diagnosis of inflammatory bowel disease to be picked up and pulled out. And over the time, they certainly showed an increase in the incidence, but we can see that the prevalence also increased. So we're picking up cases, but potentially we're also managing some of these longer, and potentially the age at which we're diagnosing them may be decreasing because we have this comparatively increased population that we continue to follow. But I think importantly, we have seen this change, and if you truly believe that an administrative database is picking this up of everyone within that province, then it shouldn't be reflecting practice referral changes and things like that. This should be a true change within your population. A big study done in 2006 by Charles Bernstein's group out of Manitoba showed that there was a nationwide incidence of about 13.4 per 100,000 population for Crohn's disease and about 11.8 for ulcerative colitis. And Dr. Bernstein's group used this very similar method where they applied these algorithms to administrative data to try and identify cases of inflammatory bowel disease. And when we looked at particularly the breakdown of this in British Columbia, we had fairly low rates in British Columbia in comparison to the neighbouring province here in Alberta, and this is paediatric specific data. So 5.4 per 100,000 population compared to 9.4, and a more comparable ulcerative colitis population. So this certainly raised the question of, well, what's the difference? I mean, you've got two neighbouring provinces. Why such a discrepancy in their incidence? And at the time, it was attributed to the background population of British Columbia, which, in comparison to Alberta, had a much higher population of groups that have been traditionally considered low-risk populations for inflammatory bowel disease. So Asian population, South Asian, South and Central Asia. And comparing, you can see the numbers here based on the census data of 2006, that, it's about twice the South Asian population and 3 times the Asian population in British Columbia. So potentially per population, the incidence is lower because there are less people at risk. Our experience, or the experience in general, even before I got to British Columbia, was that this didn't seem to be what we were seeing in practice in clinic. We seem to be getting a lot of these patients, a lot of South Asian patients, not so much the Chinese population, but that too was increasing. And there are certainly reports coming out of Asia to suggest that the incidence within these traditionally low-risk countries is also increasing. So at one point in time, sorry, we'll just I've thrown this in to just also show that east versus west. So we're talking about the southern, the Asian bloc here, having a much lower prevalence typically than the North American. And then similarly to the North versus South, so Asia versus North America, South America, North America, that the incidence is much higher in these countries. So as I was saying, when I first got to BC Children's Hospital, our experience there was that, you know, we were seeing a different sort of picture to what these national database, administrative database surveys had suggested. And BC Children's Hospital is in somewhat of a unique situation in some regards, in that it's, theoretically at least, it's the only children's hospital for the province. Now, we all know that from northern BC we do get patients across here because it's closer for them to get here than it is to BC Children's. But when you look at administrative data, it's still all captured within the admin data, so billings still go back to BC Health. For the most part, though, with those exceptions, because if they are cases that are being lost to or detected and managed by, say, Alberta Children's or here, they're still added cases. So even the baseline for BC should still be captured reasonably accurately by looking at a database of BC Children's Hospital, in the sense that if you believe that all cases funnel back down to this single children's hospital, you've got a very good, even though it's a single centre, it should be somewhat reflective of a population group. And so I went back and pieced together bits of a database that had gone back to 1985 and updated all that, so that we had every child who'd been diagnosed or managed. So if they'd been diagnosed out of province and then come back, or diagnosed and managed within BC Children's Hospital back to 1985, which gave us a little over 1,100 patients within a database up to November 2011. When we looked at the group overall, so from 1991 to 2004, we certainly saw that the cases that we were diagnosing within that population had significantly increased. Now, this isn't to say that this is a true increase in incidence, but what we were seeing within our clinical population was about 3-4-fold higher than what we had been seeing. And so, again, you have to factor in a lot of differences: population changes, immigration changes, referral patterns to the hospital. When we break this down by diagnosis, however, we're seeing that the total had increased. The indeterminate colitis and the ulcerative colitis rates had stayed much the same, but we had seen this increase in Crohn's disease. When we took that population and broke it down by ethnicity, there were two things that came up. One is that we had this very high-risk population within the Ashkenazi Jew population. This is well documented. There are certain genetic susceptibilities that have been well identified amongst this group. However, in total, they make up a very small population within paediatrics in British Columbia. In comparison, 5.4% of our population is identified as being South Asian, and this was the second highest group within our group, so higher than the Caucasian population, which was sort of very odd, because again, this is traditionally a low-risk, low-incidence group of people. So I sought to sort of have a look a bit more closely at what was going on with this group. When we talk about South Asia, specifically, it's primarily India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh that have been considered South Asia. There are different definitions, so we need to be a little bit cautious as to what we're looking at in terms of true ethnicity and genetic susceptibility within those groups. The United Nations now classifies South Asia as also involving the Maldives, Nepal, Bhutan through here, and also obviously Sri Lanka is involved in that little dot down there. Some places are also including Iran and Afghanistan. So your definition can be a little bit, it can be important. Typically, though, what we're really looking at is this traditional or general definition of South Asia, sort of that darker green block through there. If we take the greater group, the estimated population is 1.7 billion. So even if it's a fairly low incidence within that country, we should be getting decent reports of cases. And that hasn't been the case so much over the years. If you look at the background population of the background data that's available for South Asia, it's a bit sparse at the moment, and this is possibly because it hasn't been a disease of much significance within the countries for many years. And we go back, and there's been a few studies. Some of these are very small centre studies and aren't representative of bigger groups, but there have been a few studies we've looked at that have been looked at, specifically in the Punjab region of northern India, and that'll become more relevant in time when we discuss today. They found, though, that ulcerative colitis, this was a study that specifically looked at ulcerative colitis, and it was a very interesting study. because they went and knocked on doors. And they found 51,910 subjects, and that's a whole lot of doors to knock on. So they went around, knocked on doors, and they did questionnaires with people and said, do you have any of these symptoms? Could you have potentially ulcerative colitis? If you've got symptoms, we're going to scope you. Now, that study alone just blows me away, but to do that would be phenomenal. Their crude incidence rate was 6 per 100,000 population, which is not that different to what we're seeing in Western countries in terms of ulcerative colitis. This was adults or primarily adults, to be honest. There were some older children who were involved in it. And, you know, this was quite interesting because previously, again, this was something that was thought to be fairly low. And this is reflected in some studies where, particularly in the UK, where immigrants to the UK from India, northern India, particularly Punjab and other regions nearby, had been found to have a higher or a similar incidence of ulcerative colitis to their Caucasian countrymen. And this is sort of one of the first reports where we'd seen that potentially this is actually going on, maybe just not being reported adequately. Subsequently, in Sri Lanka, a study was done, and they found significantly lower levels in comparison to what this study was suggesting. But, again, methodology and epidemiology need to be considered. This is a hospital-based study, so this is a referral group, it's an isolated group, and they were finding very small cases, very small numbers. And this is the sort of data that's coming out of Asia, out of so China, Japan, Korea, all of these places that we've considered to be low risk have had similar sorts of rates, maybe up to 1 or 2 per 100,000, but certainly not in this sort of volume that we're seeing in Western countries. Most of the time across the board, which mirrors what we saw originally with inflammatory bowel disease in Western countries, there's been this higher rate of ulcerative colitis as opposed to Crohn's disease. And we certainly saw this in the early experience with inflammatory bowel disease in Western countries. There was an increase in ulcerative colitis. That seems now to have plateaued, and now we're having this breakthrough of Crohn's disease. Whereas in countries where it hadn't seemed to be such a big deal, we're seeing the ulcerative colitis, not so much the Crohn's disease. And another interesting fact that most studies seem to have supported a male predominance for this, whereas we've not tended to have that same experience in a lot of the Western data. In the UK, they did look at some of these groups, this is sort of back in the late 90s and early 2000s. They looked at many of these groups, and they found that there was a shift from things like intestinal tuberculosis and genital tuberculosis towards ulcerative colitis, and these were in immigrants coming to the country, as well as people who had been born there but of Indian ethnicity, primarily Indian ethnicity at least. And so they had a higher rate of ulcerative colitis, or a similar rate to the Caucasian non-Indian people within the UK, but they seemed to have a slower progression of disease, and the time to surgery was significantly less within those South Asian groups than within the Caucasian groups. It also suggests that perhaps it was a different phenotype of disease, that their ethnicity, their susceptibility genes and the like may not have been the same as what were being seen within Caucasian populations. So when we came back then to the South Asian pediatric population within BC, in 2003, one of the groups there looked at the data and in terms of the incidence of this group, because as I said, it had been seen to be much higher than what had been suggested elsewhere. And we actually found that there was a 15.9 per 100,000, so almost 16 per 100,000 population. This is just within the kids of South Asian, based on the census data for South Asian population in BC at that time. When this was broken down, we had a rate of 6.4 and 6.6 for UC. So not only is this much higher than what had previously been reported, but the Crohn's disease aspects seem to be unusually high for this group as well, which had been traditionally predominated by ulcerative colitis. In comparison, within this same cohort, the non-South Asian, so this was Caucasian, and at that time there were basically no Eastern Asian or South Asian, Eastern Asian or Southeast Asian ethnicities reflected in that cohort, were found to have a third of the incidence rate. And this is probably about right for what was being reported within Caucasian populations. Maybe a little bit lower, but still higher than what we were seeing, but with a significant Crohn's disease population. So this raised this question of, why are we seeing such a high incidence of inflammatory bowel disease, and in particular Crohn's disease, within this population in British Columbia, particularly within an ethnicity that previously, and from all other reports internationally, had suggested a very low risk of disease. That data at the time, again, supported the concept of a male predominance with an odds ratio of 1.8, but compared to, I should say, similarly to the UK data, a tendency for more extensive colonic disease. So odds ratio there of 2.5, so nearly 2.5 times more likely to have more extensive colonic or primary colonic disease than small bowel, upper GI, or perianal disease in the non-South Asian population. And in Crohn's disease, particularly where we see a lot of terminal ileal, like small bowel and colonic disease, or perianal disease, the South Asian population seem to have a much more significant tendency towards pancolonic disease. So the distribution of their disease in comparison, not just the incidence now, we're seeing to be different based on potentially ethnicity or some aspect related to ethnicity, and a significant association. We also found that there was a tendency for people to have been second-generation immigrants. So I'm just going to take a second to explain this, because it depends on how you want to define it. Essentially, what most people refer to as first-generation immigrants is if you've moved and immigrated to a country, you're a first-generation Canadian, for instance, right? You've been born in India or wherever it might have been, born in the UK, for instance, and you've got Indian ethnicity, but you've moved to Canada. And in our experience with this group, the second generation, so the children born to people who hadn't previously moved to Canada, so children born in Canada were the group predominated within this section. So, 1 versus 12.6. So you're far more likely to have been born here rather than to have immigrated here as a child from India. And this is not something that's been reflected so much in the adult data where they've looked at ulcerative colitis in those previous UK studies that I mentioned. In comparison, the non-IBD South Asian population, so when we looked at the total South Asian population within BC 16 years or below, according to the BC census data, it was significantly different. So if you were born here, if you were born in Canada, you had a much higher likelihood of developing IBD. The other interesting breakdown was that the vast majority of this group were from the Punjab region of India, so northern India, and the majority of them were of Sikh religious variant, which may make a difference in terms of not only their ethnicity and their genetic variance over time, but also potentially things like diet and other traditional practices. So that was this was the population that we were seeing. More recently, what I've done is I've looked at the group over time and wondered whether or not, let's have a look at this disease. Is it really different disease? Do they behave more differently? Because anecdotally, we seem to think that they were more severe. They seem to be sicker. They seem to escalate through their therapy. So we chose to look at that in a little bit more depth. And over time, we'd collected a larger group. The previous group was about 75, so we sort of doubled that volume of patients within an extra few years. And what I did was take randomly selected age-matched controls from this same cohort and compared them, so compared the non-Asian population. It was on a 2-to-1 ratio just to try and improve the statistical power of the study, because we were dealing with relatively small numbers in some respects. So we had nearly 300 controls, about 150 South Asian patients, and again we saw that this male to female ratio, the predominance for male to be supported as previous studies. But we did notice that there was a significantly shorter duration of symptoms. So the South Asian patients were presenting with a mean of 4.4 months compared to about 9 months in the non-South Asian population, and statistically that was a significant finding. When we looked at the disease subtype, in the controls, again, as previous studies had suggested, we saw this predominance of Crohn's disease. Yet in the South Asian population, unlike previous studies, we saw a more balanced perspective. I guess you could say that it was more ulcerative colitis, but previous studies have suggested that the Crohn's disease population should have been much less. At symptoms, so we're breaking down the sort of presenting type of issue, again there were significant differences found. So between the South Asian and the controls, the South Asian patients were more likely to present with just kind of general abdominal pain problems, specifically right lower quadrant pain. They were also more likely to have anemia at presentation, but a lot of the other things didn't seem to make a big difference. In comparison, the controls were far more likely to have what we call extraintestinal manifestations, including perianal disease, canker sores within the mouth or mouth ulcers, and fevers of unexplained origin. So, I mean, certainly not a diagnostic tool necessarily, but it does suggest that there are differences in the way that the disease presents and the phenotype. Specifically looking at, I apologise, the formatting here seems to have dropped fairly badly, but these are the odds ratios with the 95% confidence intervals in brackets behind. But when we looked at the breaking down for diseases, as well as looking at the group as a whole, we also saw significant differences in the type of therapy that they received. Now, we need to be a little bit careful. We know that inflammatory bowel disease is an extremely heterogeneous presentation. Every patient has to have therapy tailored to them. Having said that, within a group of people that has been fairly stable over many years, so the same group of physicians, and practice that within that group being fairly standardised, not exactly, but fairly standardised, the tendency for escalation of therapy is fairly representative probably of the group. So to say that we've got one group, one doctor who's escalating an inflammatory bowel disease therapy in a South Asian patient over and above that of a Caucasian patient doesn't really make sense, and is not the sort of thing that we were seeing in practice when we looked at specific numbers of these groups. In comparison, though, when we just looked at outright numbers, I should say, we did see certainly that there was a significant, significant increase in those patients that reached not only immunomodulatory therapy, so Imuran or azathioprine or 6-mercaptopurine, methotrexate, but also biological therapy with anti-TNF blockade, as well as ultimately surgery. So that may suggest a more severe type of phenotype or a more treatment-resistant phenotype of disease. It's very hard to study severity of disease because a lot of it is somewhat subjective, I suppose, in terms of how unwell you feel. We do use standardized scoring systems, but we know that there is limitations to that. So as a kind of a surrogate of severity of disease, we can look at this escalation. So are therapies working? Are people having to get onto more extensive or bigger guns in terms of our treatments as a bit of a benchmark for how well disease is being controlled? In the ulcerative colitis population, we saw a similar thing. So a much greater tendency for patients to end up on immunomodulatory therapy rather than just 5-ASA, basic topical anti-inflammatory therapy. And again with, sorry, lost my mouse here, with the biological therapy. Not such a big difference with surgery, and I suppose that with ulcerative colitis that may not be very different. But in comparison to that earlier UK study where they seem to have a slower or a lower rate and a slower progression to surgery, this was suggesting that maybe a little bit the other way, or at least the same. So the raw numbers tell us one story, but it's also important that we think about how quickly did they get there, because that also indicates a severity. So if you're escalating through therapy because your initial therapies aren't controlling your disease, then that may reflect a more severe phenotype. So when we look at the survival analysis for these, the time to, this is for all IBD, so both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease combined, there was clearly a tendency for the South Asian population to end up on immunomodulatory therapy faster. This is by the same physicians in the same hospital. This is a big difference, an odds ratio of 6. And that suggests that patients either were unwell and needed to be on bigger therapy, or that they were presenting with more severe disease at the time of therapy, and so they warranted a higher level of maintenance therapy. And when we break this down for disease, we see that the Crohn's disease makes up a very significant population, but so too does ulcerative colitis. That whatever was going on, where a lot of these patients may have been maintained on 5-ASA therapy for a lot longer before being escalated to immunomodulatory-based therapy, this was needing to be done a lot faster within this group. With biological therapy, again, for both combined population, Crohn's and ulcerative colitis, the difference wasn't as significant, but still very impressive, 2.6 odds ratio. And when we look at specific disease subtypes, again, we see that both for Crohn's disease, less so for, both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. Sorry, I haven't put that slide in, but for Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, that this was the case. We do see that for Crohn's disease, which has typically been the population that we've used biological therapy in for longer, that they were being escalated due to either severity of disease or treatment failure at a faster rate than their non-South Asian controls. Surgery was not one that we found as significantly different. So for all IBD, it does reach a statistical significance, but you can see that the differences between the groups is much smaller, with an odds ratio only 1.8. So you're still more likely to need surgery if you're of South Asian descent. This was true certainly for Crohn's disease, and that's where the bulk of the difference was. So either colectomy or segmental resection. The vast majority of these were subtotal colectomy. You're almost twice as likely to need an operation if you had Crohn's disease and you were South Asian. The difference with ulcerative colitis wasn't significant, as you can see here. And I guess in some respects we can argue that ulcerative colitis, once you've kind of failed therapies, you're far more likely to get an operation anyway, because we know that that's a curative procedure. So in ulcerative colitis in general, there's probably a greater tendency for people to end up with an operation, with colectomy, if they've failed therapy. So in summary of the pediatric South Asian group then, we saw that there was this higher incidence of disease amongst that South Asian population within British Columbia, and that they seemed to have certainly more ulcerative colitis than the non-South Asian population, but more Crohn's disease than what had previously been described within this group. They had a shorter duration of symptoms, more extensive colonic disease, and what seemed to be a more rapid escalation of therapy. The bulk of these patients, and again this was confirmed with the more recent study, were second-generation Canadian patients, and were far less likely to have a family history of inflammatory bowel disease. The general literature suggests between about 20 to 30% of pediatric patients have a family history. We were seeing sort of 6-7%, up to 12% in the previous study, having had a family history of anyone in the family, first degree or further. It makes you wonder why. Why is this group so different not only to what's happening in India, but why are they so different to what's happening to other patients within the country that they've immigrated to? And we've thought for a while that if you immigrate to a country that there are a number of disease patterns where we know that you take on the risk of the disease, the background incidence of the disease that is in that country, so that if you've moved to that country, whatever exposures you're given, elevate your previous risk to the risk of what the country you're living in. But still, you have to ask the question, well, why does that happen? Why is it happening in the kids that are born here, but not in the patients who are moving here? What aspects of it? Is there some critical time of exposure to issues that are making a difference? And there is a lot of work being done looking at this, and so I want to just in the last few minutes, if we can, just to touch on some of these issues. In terms of the clicker question we had earlier, the currently accepted kind of the explanation of IBD is that we do have this interplay between mucosal immunity and factors related to that, environmental triggers and genetic susceptibility, but that no single point in this accounts for sufficiently all of disease. With IBD genetics now, there have been some very large genome-wide association studies that are now most recently published in Nature. 163 susceptibility loci have been identified. And 71 of those were new based on this massive meta-analysis that this group performed. 110 of these susceptibility loci are associated with both disease phenotypes, both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. And that alone suggests that there's some other factor that determines which one you get. Amongst this, we now have identified over 25,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms associated with at least one of these phenotypes. So again, there are lots and lots of variabilities, lots of individual variability in the disease, and lots of people have been looking at how does this define where you're going to get disease? How does it define how your disease is going to respond to therapy? Are you going to be a responder to some of these therapies and not to others? Are you going to have more penetrating disease or more stricturing disease? And now the ability to determine to that level hasn't been established, but people continue to look at this sort of issue. Obviously, we're also worried about how do we identify these people who are going to be at most risk. Interestingly, about 70% of the IBD identified loci are shared with other complex diseases, in particular other autoimmune diseases. And so it suggests that there are similar immune-related processes that are going on, but clearly the chain of events that leads to IBD versus diabetes or psoriasis or immunodeficiency is different. Having said that, all of this accounts for a minority in the variance of disease risk that we see. This really only accounts for about 20 or 30% of the total number of inflammatory bowel disease cases we see, these genetic susceptibility factors. So the bulk of disease has to be explained by something else. One of the major mutations that was identified that really gave us an insight as to what was going on was one called NOD2, which is a nucleotide oligomerization domain, which is involved with bacterial regulation and toll-like receptor response. So when you don't have a NOD2, when you have a NOD2 mutation that doesn't work properly, you have an inability, I guess, to modulate this internal homeostasis. You don't recognize bacteria or commensal bacteria as easily and maintain a state of tolerance. Now, given how many things we put into our body in terms of dietary antigens, let alone the bacteria that are going on, there's a very, very delicate dance between what we recognize as foreign and as offensive versus what we have to be able to tolerate in order to maintain intestinal homeostasis. And so a lot of concern had been focused on an aberrance in this mechanism leading to an uncontrolled inflammatory response, or an inappropriately uncontrolled inflammatory response. And now, in Crohn's disease, 3 main mutations had been found in 23% of sporadic cases. Subsequent studies showed that all of these main 3 NOD2 mutations were actually absent within the South Asian population. A subsequent study by the same group found that there were 8 different polymorphisms in the South Asian population that had not been previously described within the Caucasian population, but that none of them were associated with Crohn's disease. So even within NOD2, there's aspects about it that are important for IBD, but clearly some that aren't, or that there's some other genetic or some other environmental trigger that is absent within this population, because these studies were actually done within India, not within Indian populations in other countries. 2 of these polymorphisms were weakly associated with ulcerative colitis, but they certainly don't have the same impact amongst the South Asian population that they do within within the Caucasian population. And this is just one genetic example that I chose to look at. So we know then the role of genetics accounts for only about 80% of disease that we see. Many of the genes also are present in fairly high frequency within the target population, so our at-risk populations. But we know that they confer only, in reality, a fairly modest increase in the risk of actually developing disease, so that there are other factors that contribute to this. And also over, the last 100 years, the recognized stability of the human genome fails to explain why we're seeing such rapid changes in incidence amongst the total inflammatory bowel disease population nationally, let alone certain subgroups. A lot of work has been done looking at some of these other environmental triggers, if you like. So we have this this genetic and immune interaction, but there's been a whole range of things that have been examined. We know that the risk of smoking decreases your risk of ulcerative colitis. Not enough to be a good reason to take up ulcerative smoking, mind you, but that it's significantly associated with a greater risk of Crohn's disease. This hasn't been demonstrated to the same extent within the South Asian population. Diet is a big one. With all the dietary antigens we put into our body, maybe there's some aspect of diet between these countries that we can see. And as a side, the interesting thing is we found of the South Asian population, of those grandparents within the family there that were on a traditional diet, about 70% of parents maintained a traditional South Indian diet. Of the children, less than 50% maintain that diet. So within the kids, we are seeing much more of an influence of Western diet. So maybe there's something in that. A lot of drugs and ways that they interact. We know that higher socioeconomic status and sort of this hygiene hypothesis, that the cleaner you are, the more likely you are to get these diseases, may have a role, and other aspects of stress, and a big focus at the moment on the microbial and the intestinal interaction. So with the microbiome, we have, as we all know, both bugs we want and bugs we don't want. And bugs that we want are good in some places, not so good in other places within the body. So there's a balance that the body needs to maintain. And this has been coined a balanced microbiota, so that we have a normal species or a normal collection of species of bugs within the body that we're supposed to have. But there's good evidence to suggest that there is specificity of host to determine what those bugs are. Now, I'm not going to sort of spent any time really going through the complexity of microbiome and of research, because we have experts like Dr. Wine here who are looking at this, and he'll put his hand up if he has the answer to all of this. But essentially what's come from it is this concept of an intestinal dysbiosis. So somehow or another the bugs that are there are either not being recognised as things that we should have, or they're inappropriately triggering a mechanism of inflammation, or potentially that this bug population has shifted so that it's pushing towards an inflammatory process. And this is linked to a number of things, particularly toll-like receptor signaling, as we've mentioned earlier with the NOD2 receptors, but also aspects of autophagy, where certain intracellular pathogens are consumed by phagosomes and lysosomes and disposed of, as well as this process of regulatory T cells which promote this tolerance within the intestinal environment. So breakdowns or genetic susceptibilities to those types of processes may be the reason why this is going on. We're all exposed to this. We all have these. We know that a lot of people have these susceptibilities. It still doesn't really explain why the South Asian population, when they're transplanted to a different country, suddenly have this much higher rate of things going wrong. So when we specifically look at the South Asian group, we know that there are different mutations, but as mentioned, it doesn't really explain the time frame, because these mutations, the genome is not changing rapidly enough to account for this. We do have this question mark about why is it one generation more so than another, and also the phenotype of disease. We are seeing reports that suggest this is increasing, much more in South Asia than in the Asia, than major Eastern Bloc like Central Asia. And this has raised this question of nutrigenomics. Is there an aspect of food that is manipulating our diet, our genetic sequences? And similarly with microbial exposure, is there some aspect of the microbe that changes our genome or changes our expression of these genes and the adaptability of the immune regulation from one environment to another? Which brings me to a topic that I think is worth looking at. Now, there's no answers here. It's an emerging field. It's still, the technology is really only becoming available now for us to have a look at a lot of this stuff. But I think there's some very notable and worthwhile considerations for this type of population, this type of problem. So epigenetics has been around for a long time, but in fact it's been around longer than we've understood the human genome, and it was first described as the original, it was how the environment may impact on our genotype in order to express disease. And for the most part it's been the research is focused on cancer therapy. Now that we've got other abilities and genome-wide assays, information from that to work with, this is emerging a lot faster now. And it's essentially defined as hereditable changes to phenotype due to mechanisms other than changes to the underlying DNA sequence. So the two main mechanisms by which this happens is DNA methylation, which we see in a lot of other conditions, and post-translational histone modification. So these are things that are occurring to the genome at critical periods of time, influenced significantly by environmental factors. We know that these are more easily and rapidly influenced by environmental factors, and hence may account for the changes we're seeing in a short period of time. We know that a lot of these factors are also very orchestral, in the maintenance of intestinal tolerance, because our body has to be able to modify fairly rapidly exposure to different dietary or environmental antigens. So I didn't do it that time. What we're looking at in terms of tolerance of something, if you then go to a different country and eat a different food, you don't suddenly want your body to say, well, this is an inflammatory process, this pawpaw versus that pawpaw, or this mango versus the mango I could get in Canada. There are going to be genetic differences to these foods, right? What they're grown in, the soil they're grown in, the things they're exposed to. But we need to maintain some sort of balance, some ability to change at fairly rapid pace. The hygiene hypothesis also links back into this, because potentially the exposure to some certain microbes in early life may result in protection from some of these diseases, because it may switch certain immune processes on or off, certain genes on and off, and that there may be crucial periods of time whilst this occurs. So if your epigenome can be passed on, so some of these are wiped out in gametes, but a lot of them can be passed on. If you're getting an epigenome from your parents that normally would be exposed to a South Asian environmental trigger, where you have a certain response to genes, but then you're putting that genetic influence into a Western country with different environmental triggers. It may be that some of these genes are either activated or deactivated, depending on the circumstance, which may put you at much more significant risk of some of these diseases. So in time, it may be that looking at these types of environmental triggers, what is it about growing up or being born in Canada rather than being born in South Asia, as your genetics may have chosen you to have been so, predispose you to some of these disease phenotypes. And how will this potentially allow us to identify the cases where we know you're going to end up like this because this is your phenotype of disease, therefore we're going to use this treatment straight away? Should we be escalating some of these patients earlier, rather than waiting until they have failed therapy? Which is a way of looking at, can we be changing the natural outcome of this disease rather than waiting for complications of the disease now? Because when we're talking about diagnosing 5- and 6-year-old children with IBD, they've got a long way ahead of them on some pretty potent medications, and which, to be honest, we don't really know in 30, 40 years what the impact of these medications is having on them, or will have on them. The challenges with epigenetics is that it's cell type specific. So when we take biopsies, we get a bit of epithelium, we get some different cells, we get blood, we get this. The genome is specific to the cell type. So techniques to purify cell types have to be developed in order to look at this. And then also, which cell type do we look at? What's really going to allow us within the gut environment with a whole lot of different cells to identify these mechanisms? And clearly then we're going to have to look at very careful epidemiological selection in terms of being able to identify clearly one trigger versus another trigger. It becomes very, very challenging when we consider the sorts of things that we eat, the sorts of things we're exposed to on a daily basis. And for those of us that don't have these types of diseases, we should be very thankful that our body works it out for us rather than having to think about it and end up with breakdown in these regulations. It's a very fine-tuned machine, which I think most of us tend to abuse more often than we should. So on that note, there's some references. I'm happy to pass those on to anyone who would like to have them. But if you'd like to ask any questions, I'll hopefully be able to answer some of them. And we might start by the external sites if they have any questions.
You can ask here while they're thinking about it.
Yep.
Any questions?
I really enjoyed this talk. It was fascinating. I have two questions. One is relatively straightforward, and one I think is a bit of a fantasy. But the first one relates to the generational issue. And I kind of wonder, were they age adjusted? Because little kids, the age of which you get the disease, you might still be sick in say, India or Pakistan, and you don't immigrate here. And so there's a slight possibility that you're selecting your populations to cause the bias. And I just wonder if that was considered at all, if you're looking at relatively the same age of onset of disease in these second generation versus the first generation kids. And the second one, which is admittedly a bit weird, but I wonder about the role of genetically modified organisms, such as Roundup Ready wheat. And because we do know that can modify physiology to some degree. And it's more common, it is grown in Canada, used in Canada, and so that may be a factor that might modify how our body responds to situations such as maybe even altering the microbiota in the gut. And it may not be as prevalent yet, the use of those compounds may not be as prevalent yet in Southeast Asia, although that is changing, and that may again account for a changing in the pattern of IBD there as well.
Absolutely, thank you. So just for the other sites to recap, the first question was regarding the epidemiology and the methodology, I guess, of these studies, or whether or not age-adjusted patients were being compared. So within the Canadian population, because BC is a relatively captured population, i.e. if we presume that the majority of those patients, as would seem to be the case, and we've also done some pilot data looking at Ministry of Health data to look at how many children are being diagnosed within the country in total, in the province in total, versus how many were actually being seen through BC Children's Hospital. And in fact, the vast majority of them are captured within BC Children's Hospital. So if we say that we're representing roughly speaking, representing the population of children within BC, then disease that's presenting or has presented should be picked up by that group. So we did age match those controls and then with the South Asian, but this is a cohort study, right? The retrospective cohort. These patients already have disease. It's very hard for us at this point to know who's at risk of disease. And so I think at times these studies do warrant being repeated and looking back and seeing have these things changed compared to what was going on, because we are seeing an increasing prevalence as well. I tried to, as best as possible, to match them so that if you were diagnosed at 7 as a South Asian population, you got 2 controls who were diagnosed at 7 within the non-South Asian population. And it's an incident study though, so we have to look at the fact that there may be others who are presenting. The data from South Asia really just isn't there at the moment. I mean, they just haven't looked at it to the same extent. Maybe one of the reasons why Canada has the highest published incidence and prevalence of IBD is because it's being researched a lot, right? We're good at looking at it, we're good at databases, people have been very good at reporting on this, and in other countries that's not necessarily the case. So there may be inherent bias to that. But I think if you have 1.7 billion population, you should be seeing a rate of this disease as chronic as it is, which they're just not reporting. So either it's a milder disease and they're not getting the same complications that we see. I mean, if I go to the adult IBD meetings, these people are in hospital having their colons removed. I mean, they're often very sick people. That's just not being reported in a lot of these countries. So there is that potential for bias, and I think it's very challenging when you're doing epidemiological studies and when we're looking at incidence studies that people who have published on single centre studies haven't necessarily thought about the fact that there may be referral biases, that there may be differences within their population, and it's caused an increase in incidence when in actual fact it's an increase in disease pickup within your centre. And that can be for a lot of reasons. So I take your point. I'm not sure that there's an easy way to adequately look at that. Some sideline data that I've been looking at is with the administrative population studies that have been done in Canada. And certainly one issue that's come up is that you have to validate your algorithm for your population. You can't take an algorithm that's been used in Toronto to identify cases and apply it to the BC data. We've done that. They got 97% specificity, we got 62. It just doesn't capture the same population because there are differences amongst groups and practices. So I think that's a very valid point, and I think the trends suggest that there is truly a difference, but the specifics are much more challenging to identify. And within our group, I mean, within those 150 kids, they do seem a 6-fold change seems to be something that's quite noteworthy, and it's not explained easily by the practice or the referral pattern. The second question you asked was regards to genetically modified foods and organisms and things that we're being exposed to here. And I think that's a very valid question. I don't have the answer to that. Intuitively, I think that it probably does make an impact and that we don't really know what that impact is, but we've been really keen to jump on the bandwagon, or industry has at least. There is clearly evidence that more traditional Eastern diets and lifestyles are being westernized, I suppose, for want of a better term. And it's probably an element that has contributed to a lot of emerging diseases that have traditionally been considered Western. In terms of why they come here and have such a higher rate, it may well be that their genetic background, their genetic susceptibilities react very differently to what we've been exposed to over a much longer period of time. So there's been a chance for tolerance or something, or other changes within those expressed genes to adapt. There may just be inherent differences between us, and certainly we do see that with certain disease types. But I think that's something that's yet to be really clearly elucidated, but I suspect has a massive impact.
I have a question. It's more concerning the microbiome hypothesis. In asthma and allergies, the data shows that there seems to be a protection if you were born vaginally and breastfed. Is it something that has been studied or found?
I'm not aware that that mode of delivery has been specifically looked at with IBD. I could be wrong. Can you guys comment on that at all? No. Certainly breastfeeding has been looked at, and early antibiotic usage is another aspect that has been looked at, and there are associations at this point, not causative studies to my knowledge, but there are certain associations that have been identified with early antibiotic exposure and prolonged breast milk exposure to a point. So beyond that, there's a thought that if you're breastfed particularly beyond 2 years, that you may actually have a decreased exposure to a lot of these environmental pathogens and therefore may have an aberrant tolerance response. Again, these are association studies though, and there have been no causative links as far as I know. The population, the colonisation of the bowel happens very early on in life, and it tends to be fairly similar to the household in which you live. So again, one of the questions there is, why are we seeing these sporadic cases if everyone's got a very similar, like families are inheriting a similar genome? It may be that it's those early exposures, early environmental exposures that do make a difference. If you're exposed within India at an early age, you have one response, but if you're exposed to different environmental triggers in another country, such as Canada, in those same critical defining periods of time, you may end up with a very different genomic expression. And breastfeeding probably does have some protective factor early on in terms of the hygiene hypothesis anyway.
Last question.
Thank you very much, man. Very nice talk. I have a couple of questions for you. One is there a specific reason you did not include beyond second generation immigrants? That was the first question. The second question is, were you able to tease out those immigrants who, like to say, migrated from the UK versus those who migrated from Southeast Asia?
Mostly, so the answer to the first question was, did we include beyond second generation Canadians? This is a cohort study, so we took who was diagnosed, right? These are diagnosed cases. We weren't case controlling or prospectively studying. These are cases that are presented, and the population of that group were predominantly second generation. There were some first generation. There was about 4 beyond second generation, but like 80–90% of them are second generation. That's an observation. That's not a patient selection. This is the group of people who are being diagnosed with disease. Within the adult group, there have been some studies from BC from the adult group at St Paul's Hospital where they did look at this, and they certainly saw a higher South Asian population. Their study didn't extend to generational levels like that. So they're reporting again a higher adult incidence, not quite as high as what we've seen, and that there may be biases inherent to that, but they didn't comment on the generationality, so it's hard to really know. But it wasn't that we didn't include them, it's just that they weren't representative within that group of patients who were being diagnosed for whatever reason. I guess watch this space. Maybe it's a matter of time that the population has increased so much that we need more time to be able to identify those changes. The second question was, remind me?
As you know, as you mentioned earlier, there have been several different migrations.
Oh, yes, of course, yep.
Be able to see those parts of the generation.
Yeah. So I think this is something that's inherently biased to that BC population. It needs to be looked at in other countries, and particularly countries like Australia would be very useful in that respect. The Southeast Asian population does not make up a big cohort of population within BC, certainly at this point in time anyway. And so they were significantly underrepresented. The Asian bloc makes up, so Central Asia makes up a very large group, and their rate of disease is significantly lower. And we really, I mean, we've got a handful of patients that are Chinese or Korean who have IBD within that group, and it's very hard to make statements or analyses about whether their disease is particularly different or not, because we're getting incidences more along the lines of 0.06 to 0.1 per 100,000 as opposed to 15 per 100,000. So I think that may change as population immigration changes, but within BC at the moment, the primary population is not of Southeast Asian descent. The studies that are coming out of Southeast Asia itself suggest...
Using more definitions, the Southeast Asia definition I was using included the greater East India.
Oh no, we looked at all of that group. So it was the fact that 80-odd% were from the Punjab region. There were other areas identified, certainly, and also Fijian ethnicity. So there's certainly that genetic extraction. So that's sort of, if you look at the larger South Asia, when I think of Southeast Asia, I'm thinking more Malaysia, Singapore, these other countries more in the Southeast Asian South Pacific, if you'd like, group. But certainly there's been studies that have looked at other groups. Sri Lanka doesn't seem to have quite as high a rate. I think the Afghanistan, we've talked about this before, but Afghanistan, Punjab, I mean, the line that was drawn is somewhat arbitrary, and I'm sure there's a lot of genetic commonality through that over centuries. It just happened again that for whatever reason, and I think this is probably a tendency of immigrational preference, you know.
The conference is about to end.
That the Punjab group is very highly represented within BC, not as much as what we were seeing in our study. So it may be that there's something specific to that group, but they're overrepresented within BC, so they are inherently biased to that group. And it's an observational study rather than a causative one, so it's hard to comment.
All right, in the interest of time, we're going to have to shut it down. It's 9:35 already, but I'm sure Matthew will be very happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.